In the mid-1990s, I was asked by the U.S. Attorney from Minneapolis to come to Minneapolis and teach a 3-day, very intensive community policing class to the Minneapolis Police Department. At the time, I was still on the police department, but was a national instructor for community policing for DOJ. Of course, I agreed to do it, and the U.S. Attorney and I scheduled several sessions over a period of several months so we could get the entire police department through this 3-day class. I failed to do my homework about the Minneapolis Police Department because had I done it, I would have learned that at the time, Minneapolis PD was one of the most angry, dysfunctional police departments in the country. But I didn't know that. So I show up for the very first session, and this is what happened on the very first day of the very first session of our community policing training. Officers are beginning to file into the auditorium, and the admin sergeant who's running the training for the day hands me a stack of sign-in sheets and says, hey, you have to have them sign in when they come back after every break, when they come back after lunch, and before they leave at the end of the day. And I thought that was an odd policy, but wasn't smart enough to connect the dots, because what it really indicated was there was zero trust level in that police department. That should have been my first warning sign. The second warning sign should have been that officers were coming into the room carrying pillows. And it wasn't because they had bad backs. We could force people to be in the room, but you can't force people to be engaged, to pay attention, to be willing to learn. Those things are willingly offered by each of us to our own enterprises. And this is what these officers were doing for the very first 2 hours of this class. Some of them immediately fluffed their pillows up, threw their legs over the chairs in front of them, and went to sleep. Some of the officers were reading newspapers in class. Now remember, this was the mid-90s before we had smartphones and iPads and things to read. And I was used to police officers reading newspapers in class back then, but typically they would fold it up into a little square, kind of hide it and think that you didn't know what they were doing, and I'm okay with that, because we're all responsible for our own learning. But these officers were reading the newspapers like this, holding them up in front of them, and people were saying, pass the sports page over here, and papers were flying around the auditorium. Some officers even were having long conversations on cell phones. And if you can remember what a cell phone looked like in the mid-1990s, it was a brick, with an antenna out to here. And so finally this goes on for 2 hours, and I eventually said, let's stop this madness. If you are paying attention, close your manuals, throw them underneath your chairs, wake up your neighbors, put down the newspapers, and let's talk about what you are so angry about. For the next 2 hours, this is no exaggeration, I didn't say one word. I simply listened as the officers vented. And I filled out 5 full pages of butcher paper as they vented about people and entities that made their life miserable. All the people that just made it intolerable to be a police officer in the city of Minneapolis. And this went on for 2 hours, and finally it got silent in the room. And I said, well, you must be finished. And they said, yeah, we are, but if you give us a bit of time, we can probably add to that list. And I said, I bet you can. But reflecting, they had listed every mayor whose name they could remember, every police chief going back 50 years, the churches that brought the refugee groups to Minneapolis, and they now had to police them, trainers who came from out of town. They even had me on the list. My favorite one was they were really angry at the media because they had the audacity to put a hidden camera in a downtown strip joint, downtown Minneapolis, and videotape an on-duty uniformed officer tending bar in the strip joint. And of course the media put that on the 5 o'clock news, and the officer in the department was embarrassed, so they were mad at the media for that. The irony of that part of the story was the officer who was the subject of that video was in the class, and he brought the video in on day 2 so we could put it on the big screen at the auditorium. Don't ask me why he was still on the job, but that was part of the dysfunction at the time. So when we finished all of this, I said to the officers, I don't know what we're going to do for the next 2.5 days of this class, because the only thing that I'm certain of right now is you are not ready for community policing training. And the good news is it's lunchtime. So I'm going to send you to lunch, and while you're at lunch, I'll regroup and figure out what are we going to do to make the next 2.5 days of this class meaningful for you and for me. And I said, but before you go, I just want you to do one thing for me. Take a look at this list of all the people and entities who make your life miserable. And you left one group of people off the list. And immediately when I asked the question, they kind of chuckled and said, yeah, us. We don't like ourselves very much either. And I said, no, it's impossible to lug this gunk with you around every single day and remotely do a good job. Human beings are not wired for that. It's humanly impossible to do that. And so I did something with them that I had never done before in a classroom, and I have never done it since, and I can't tell you why I did it on that day. But I could feel that for the first time they were locked on me. They were paying attention to me, probably because finally somebody was listening to them. And I asked them, I said, do me one favor before you leave the room. I said, I want you to close your eyes. And with their eyes closed, I talked to them about, I said, I want you to remember that first day you were on this job. That day you raised your hand and took an oath, and you got that shield that's in a badge case in your pocket, or perhaps you're wearing it on your chest. And I want you to think back to how you felt on that day when you were embarking on what you believed was this amazing journey of policing, and you were joining this incredible profession and also joining this great police department that you believed at the time was great, this Minneapolis Police Department. And I talked to them about justice and freedom and how people count on us to get it right in their darkest moments of need. I talked about that we uphold justice in the longest running democracy in the history of the world, and that's an incredibly noble calling for us. And then I had them open their eyes and I said, how did you get from that moment on that day to this, where you hate everything about your life and your work? And for some of them, it had been a very short trip. Some of them had only been on the job 18 months. But when you're healthy and you come into a sick environment, how long does it take to get sick? And these officers were getting sick with this disease of cynicism and apathy. And so I said to them, just go to lunch and reflect on what we just talked about. And when you come back from lunch, I will have regrouped. As they get up and they're filing out of the room, one of the sergeants sitting in the front row jumped up in this big booming voice and said, everybody sit back down. And I remember getting a little bit nervous because I thought, oh, he's going to take me on now because he doesn't like what I just said. But he didn't. He turned his back to me. He waited till everybody was back in their chairs and they were locked on him. And this is what he said. I'll never forget it. He said, you know what our problem is in this police department? Nobody ever talks to us like that. Nobody ever talks to us like that. And then he just turned and walked out of the room. And for me, it was like a 2x4 between the eyes, because what he had said is nobody talks to them about the nobility of what we do. Nobody talks to them about how people count on us to get it right. Nobody talks to them about the upholding of freedom and democracy. Nobody ever talks to us like that. And at the time, I was an area commander in my police department, and I reflected that entire session of lunch. I reflected on, I'm in front of my officers some days 4 and 5 times a day in roll call. I'm in front of my officers sometimes 6 and 7 days a week. And I had intentionally, because I designed the building I was in, intentionally put my office next to the roll call room so I had no excuse not to be in front of my officers. And I thought, when is the last time I spoke to my police officers about what I had just spoken to these officers about? And the answer was, I never had. And I realized that as a police commander, I made the assumption every single day that my officers are coming to work with the greatest amount of power and authority over anybody else in American society. And I make the assumption that they are coming to work in the right frame of heart, body, mind, and spirit. And I realized on that day that that is a horrible assumption for us to make, because we all know we work beside officers who are in various levels of pain. So I made a promise to myself on that day that I would never again speak to police officers, be it for an hour, be it for a day, be it for a week, without talking about the nobility of this profession, the nobility of policing.